I'm going to read the first line because this is quite interesting. To what does all the above refer? What is the above? Well, we haven't read the first 6 chapters of Sota, but it deals with those deferments that I mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Remember, if you're betrothed, but you haven't consummated the marriage, that's a deferment. So after all of these deferments were analyzed and dealt with in some detail, the question is asked, to what do all of these deferments refer? And that means, to what do they apply? And the answer, this is an anonymous answer. It doesn't say Rabbi Akiva said it or somebody else said it. It's an anonymous answer to discretionary wars. It's called Milchemet Reshut. But everyone must go out to fight in commanded wars, even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her wedding canopy. So this is a definition of 2 kinds of wars. Discretionary wars and commanded wars. For discretionary wars, there are deferments. For commanded wars, there are not. A commanded war is a milchemet mitzvah. When you have a mitzvah, not a mitzvah, okay, not like be nice. A mitzvah is a what? A commandment, not a good deed, it's a commandment. So if there's a commandment, who's the commander? God is the commander, and we are the commanded. So a milchemet mitzvah is a war that is commanded by God. If it's commanded by God, then there are no deferments and everyone must engage in the fighting. Right. Now, what examples do they, and then Rabbi Yehuda says, to what does all the above refer? To commanded war, but everyone must go out. In a required war, it's just different terminology. Don't worry about that. The important part here is that there are 2 different kinds of wars. One in which there are deferments, one in which there are not deferments. Are they defined? And the answer is, not here. They're not defined at all. There's no definition of what it means that is a commanded war, commanded by God. Commanded by God, it's definitely sanctioned by God. It's what I would call holy war. Okay, so let's go to the next layer, and that is the Palestinian Talmud. That's what this is, PT Sota. Does anybody have on the top there, it says Palestinian Talmud? Some of you do and some of you don't, I think. So, right, so they're wondering what's the difference between Milchemet Reshut, a discretionary war, and Milchemet Mitzvah, a commanded war. And Rabbi Yochanan says, oh, that's just a terminological difference between what Rabbi Yehuda said, and it's not important to go there. The next paragraph, Rav Hizda says, there's a conceptual difference between the 2 kinds of wars, and here's where we begin to see definitions. The rabbis contend that a commanded war would be David's war, while a required war would be Joshua's war. Or a commanded, in this case, we'll say, because there's double use of terminology that's a little confusing, that a discretionary war would be David's war, and a commanded war would be Joshua's war. Now, why am I switching it? I'm switching it because the terminology that became standard was, between the 2 types, was discretionary and commanded. But there were different periods of time when they were using different terminology. So I'm just going to not deal with that in detail because it's going to be too confusing. David's war was discretionary. Joshua's war was commanded. So tell me about Joshua's war briefly. What was Joshua's war? Jericho. And what else? Conquest. Joshua's war was conquest. So Joshua is accredited with conquering the land of Israel. Right? And David's war, what was David's wars? Yeah, creating an empire, expansion beyond the borders, perhaps, of the land of Israel. Okay. Another particular, so the difference is between expansive wars for empire, not commanded by God, but discretionary. A king can engage in them, but then there are deferments, or a commanded war, which is commanded to conquer the land of Israel. That's commanded. There are no deferments. Everyone must engage in that fighting. Another opinion is that the discretionary war is a war in which the Israelites initiate fighting, and a commanded war is a war of defense in which you're being attacked. That's at the bottom of the box there. One in which we initiate against them, and a required war or a commanded war is one in which the enemy initiates against us. So now there are two definitions for a discretionary war. One is for expansion or for initiating a war, where you think you're going to get something out of it. And then there are two definitions for commanded war. One is war of conquest of the land of Israel by Joshua, and the other is defense. Everyone must fight in a war of defense. Are we all together about that? Okay, so now we have these two categories of war. The Babylonian Talmud on the next page doesn't, for our purposes, not important to deal with because it gives a few nuances but not much of great importance. This is the first safeguard. The rabbis essentially looked at all of the wars of the Bible and they said we can kind of distill them down into two types of wars: initiated or wars of expansion, which are not required by God, and required wars, which are the conquest of the land of Israel, and wars of defense. And that sort of explains it all. And then let's not talk about it. And then they didn't talk about it. So there's very little discussion in rabbinic literature about war, despite the fact that the Bible has tons of stories about great warriors and great successes and tremendous violence, and we're so happy that we won these great wars, there were overwhelming odds, and we were able to prevail in any case. So it's wonderful. The rabbis were not interested in that, and they didn't deal with it, at least in terms of war as a phenomenon. They didn't want to talk about it, because once you start you reading these great novels, wonderful stories, you get excited and say, well, why can't we do it against these people who are oppressing us and making us miserable? That's the first safeguard. The second safeguard is the story of the three vows. This is another story, and I will tell you, I'll read it. It's much shorter than the first one, so I'll read it to you again like I did the other one, and then we'll move on. Are you ready? Take a deep breath. I have to move very quickly. A guy named Rabbi Zeira was living in Babylon, and he wanted to make Aliyah to the land of Israel. And Rabbi Yehuda was his teacher. Rav Yehuda, sorry. Shouldn't be Rabbi. Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda did not want him to go to the land of Israel. And they were arguing about it. And as good rabbis argue, you argue with texts. So Rav Yehuda said, anyone who goes up from Babylonia to the land of Israel is transgressing a positive commandment. As it says in Jeremiah, they shall be brought to Bavel, to Babylon, and there they shall remain until I take note of them, declares the Lord of hosts. Well, that's pretty strong, isn't it? You go to Bavel, you go to Babylon, because God commanded it. And wait until God tells you, you can go back to the land of Israel. But Rabbi Zeira was no slouch. And he said, this verse actually refers to the equipment used in the temple, not to the Jews themselves. This is a reference to the temple objects, not to Jews. So Rav Yehuda argues back, and he says, but it's written in another place, in the Song of Songs, a beautiful verse that occurs 3 times. God says, I make you swear, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by hinds of the field, do not wake or rouse love until it is wished. What does that mean? And Rabbi Zeira responded, yeah, this verse only teaches that Israel shouldn't go up to the land of Israel in a wall. Not clear what that means exactly here, although later people try to understand it. Okay, fine. So Rav Yehuda says, okay, maybe you got me there, but there's another I make you swear, and that one needs to be explained according to the view of Rabbi Yossi in the name of Rabbi Hanina, who said, are you totally following me on all this? Why are there these 3 vows in the Song of Songs? See, so here, what are the 3 vows? This line, Hishbati etchem benot, what is it? Hishbati etchem benot Yerushalayim b'tzvaot o b'ayalot hasadeh. That phrase occurs 3 different times in 3 different verses in the Song of Songs. And so if it's not repeated by accident, so there must be some reason for it. This is the rabbinic interpretive tradition, right? Each articulation has a message. And so it's understood that there must be 3 vows. So who are the... So who's making you swear? Who's saying I make you swear? That's God. Who are the daughters of Jerusalem? The Jews. Do not wake, rouse, or love. Don't do something until it is wished, until God says so, right? That's the parts, that's the kind of interpretive application to that. I make you swear, God says to the Israelites, I'm making you swear, you must do this, O daughters of Jerusalem, Jews, by the gazelles or hinds of the field. Do not wake or rouse love until it is wished. Right. So now this is what it teaches, according to Rabbi Hanina, that Israel should not go up to the land of Israel in a wall. That's one of the vows. In one, the Holy One made Israel also swear they should not rebel against the nations of the world. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I think I know what that means, but it doesn't say exactly what that means. Probably rebelling and fighting against the people who are in control of the Jews. And in one, the Holy One made the nations of the world swear that they wouldn't subjugate Israel too harshly. You get a little bit bad, but not too harshly. So, all right, so this was understood. Rabbi Zira said, Rabbi Yehuda said, et cetera, and now, what is the by the gazelles or by hinds of the field? Are you with me? I'm moving down some lines. That's explained by Rabbi Elazar with the following. The Holy One said, if you carry out, are you with me? We're now at the very bottom of the box, if you want to follow. The Holy One said, if you carry out the vows that I am making you vow, that's good. But if not, I will permit your flesh to be consumed like that of gazelles or hinds of the field. So that became a second safeguard. And as it was understood in rabbinic tradition and medieval tradition, it was meant, the following message was understood from this, essentially. The Jewish people should not move to the land of Israel en masse, go up to Israel as a wall. Individuals could go to the land of Israel. It's good to go to the land of Israel. There's merit in living in the land of Israel in Jewish tradition. It's not like they were against any Jews living in Israel, but the Jews should not go up en masse to the land of Israel. My comment, probably because that would look like it would be endanger the Jewish people, or at least those peoples, because it would look like there's a mass migration that they're trying to take over the land of Israel from the who? From the Byzantines, or from the Mamelukes, or from the Arabs who were there, or from the Seljuk Turks. So they said, don't go up en masse. Second, don't rebel against your Gentile masters. Live as a subjugated people. This is part of the unfathomable and inexplicable situation of the Jewish people with the destruction of the temple and living in exile. It's a kind of punishment for the sins of Israel. We have to live with it. We will be redeemed. There will be a time in which a messianic figure will come and redeem us. God will redeem us through a messianic figure. But it hasn't happened yet, so don't rebel against the Gentiles. Too dangerous. And in turn, God is going to make sure that the Gentiles don't persecute the Jews too much. Right? That's the deal. That's the second safeguard. So in the medieval world, that's the way people functioned. Maimonides codified all the huge amount of lore from the Talmud into a code of law. And in that code of law, he defines what is commanded war. And he does something very interesting, where it says Maimonides on Milchemet Mitzvah, or Maimonides Mishnah Torah. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell you what it says, basically. Don't trust me. Look at the text. He essentially says, there is a thing called Milchemet Mitzvah, even though the term Milchemet Mitzvah, that is commanded war, is never found in the Tanakh anywhere. That term does not exist in the Bible itself. But there is a mitzvah that is commanded by God, commanded war. And that war is defined by Maimonides as the war against the 7 Canaanite nations and fighting to aid Israel under attack, and fighting Amalek. Those are the 3 cases of commanded war, where the Torah commands fighting against the 7 Canaanite nations, against evil Amalek, who is evil inherent, and wars of defense. Right? How does that differ from the Talmud text that we read? Anybody have any idea? Yes. Well, okay, God is not required for defensive war, although in the Babylonian Talmud it said that Milchemet Mitzvah is defensive too. Oh, no, defensive war is there in Maimonides. You see, it says fighting to aid Israel under attack. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Except that this is, what is commanded war? It is 1, it's war against the 7 Canaanite nations, 2, against Amalek, and 3, fighting to aid Israel under attack. So that would be commanded by Maimonides according to this statement. What's missing here is, no, because that wasn't commanded anyway by the Babylonian Talmud. Expansion was discretionary war, not commanded war. What's missing here is Joshua. So killing the 7 Canaanite nations that represents for Maimonides idolatry and kind of evil, immorality, that's required, even though there might not be any more Canaanite nations left. But conquest of the land of Israel is not found in Maimonides as a commanded war, which seems to go against the sense of the Talmud. The Talmud defined what is an example of commanded war? Joshua's wars, or in the Babylonian Talmud, which we didn't read, but it's there, Joshua's wars of conquest. So then Maimonides then creates this wonderful book called Sefer HaMitzvot, in which he lists all of the positive commandments, thou shalt do, and all the negative commandments, thou shalt not do. And in none of them does he list the commandment to conquer the land of Israel. It's a big conundrum. Why doesn't he list that? Read my book, you'll find the answer. Nachmanides, who was the next great, brilliant genius of medieval Jewish life, lived 100 years after, about, a little less, than Maimonides, critiqued Maimonides and said, you left out one of the most important mitzvot. You're supposed to conquer the land of Israel. And he writes a commentary on Maimonides' list of the commandments in order to prove that Maimonides was wrong. And that's there for you to read at your leisure. I think you'll find it really interesting, but we're not going to look at it now. I'm going to, however, just read 2 pieces at the very end, which is sort of the kicker. It's a positive commandment. Do you see that at the bottom of the box at the last paragraph? Are you with me? Okay, I'll wait. Are you there? Page 8, or maybe at the beginning of page 9. It says, it is a positive commandment. There's a little space, and then it says it's a positive commandment. I'm going to just, in the interest of time, I just have to go. It's a positive commandment for all generations, obligating every individual, even during the period of exile, as it is evident from many passages from the Talmud, and the sages said, settling the land of Israel is equal to all of the commandments. Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael shkula keneged kol hamitzvot. So he makes the argument that God commanded conquest of the land of Israel. I don't think anyone could argue against that. I don't know why, I mean, I do have an idea as to why Maimonides didn't do it. But there are many commands in the Torah that says conquer the land of Israel. We read one in Deuteronomy 7. And Nachmanides says that commandment is valid for all time. It sort of upsets everything. He's saying, wow, everyone should get out and go to the land of Israel and start fighting against the Turks or the Arabs or whoever the people are. They are very powerful armies that were in control of huge swaths of land in the world, empires. That's suicidal. But he redefines conquest. And he says conquest is settlement. So you just go and live in the land of Israel. That's an example of conquest. So all you have to do is live there. He's like the first great Zionist. And many people in the Zionist movement point to him. Okay, that's it. That's the medieval period. No, there were no great migrations of people to the land of Israel, probably because of the 3 vows. There were no great significant militant movements. In fact, there were some really wild and interesting Jewish militant movements. They all, guess what happened to them? They didn't make it. One was an amazing messianic movement by a guy named Isa. His name was Isa, which means Jesus. But Isa al-Isfahani, he was a kind of neo-Jewish activist in Babylonia. And he fought against the caliph. And he had a magic, he was amazing. He could draw a magic circle that would protect his forces. And he did, and it worked, because the caliph's forces wouldn't go across the magic circle because they thought they were going to all be destroyed, until one guy actually went across. And that was the end of Isa al-Isfahani. So there were militant movements, but they didn't succeed in the medieval period, and there were very few of them. Now, that changed. It changed in the modern period, and I have 3 minutes to tell you how and why it did. I have a little more than that maybe, but not much. Remember what I said at the beginning. When there is a need for a religious community or a religious organism, it's more than a community. When it's felt that there is a need to engage in violent actions for the benefit of the community, then eventually a will and a way is found to read traditional authoritative literature and sacred text in order to justify and authorize violence. When it is too destructive to the community, we just saw those safeguards that I told you about, ways to read the tradition in order to justify not engaging in violence, right? So in the modern period, the reversal occurred. And I can't give you all the details, but this is the most interesting part of the book, so therefore you really need to buy the book. In the modern period, Jews were, especially in Eastern Europe, were not emancipated. They were not accepted. They were suffering from pogroms and miseries in Eastern Europe especially. And a variety of movements emerged in order to try to resolve the problem of the Jewish people as understood from their experiences in Eastern Europe. The Bund, socialists, workers, assimilationists, liberal Jewish movements, especially in the West, and one of them was a kind of Jewish nationalism. That became a dominant, but not the only dominant Jewish movement to resolve the problem of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Jewish territorialism, Jewish nationalism that said, look, the Poles, as they were rebelling against the Tsar, want to create their own Polish state, and they don't accept us as Poles, even though we've been living in Poland for the last 300 years. The Ukrainians are rebelling, creating their own state. They don't accept us as Ukrainians, even though we've been living there for 300 years. We speak Ukrainian like natives. So what do we do? Well, maybe we're a nation too. So that was sort of the beginning of Zionism, and Zionism was a movement that was really run by secular Jews. Secular Jews were at the forefront of the Zionist movement. Religious Jews mostly were not accepting of the idea of Zionism. Why not? Because that's right, it was breaking the 3 vows. It was calling for a mass migration to the land of Israel, essentially rebelling against the Gentile rule, right? But, right? And so most Orthodox Jews did not join the Zionist movement. There was a small group of Orthodox that joined the Zionist movement and formed their own party within the movement called Mizrahi. And they were confronted with a problem. How are you going to justify engaging in a national movement when you have these Jewish safeguards that are preventing us from doing it, A, and B, you're selling out by joining with these heretical Jewish secularists who are redefining Jewish identity in secular terms. It's not religious, and that's really evil. I mean, that's really bad. But they deeply believed in Zionism. And they believed in Zionism partly because there is a kind of messianism in Zionism among the secular Jews, not a traditional Jewish messianism, but a neo-messianism, and another kind of a messianic hopefulness among Orthodox Jews that were involved in Mizrahi, who felt that maybe this is the beginning of the messianic redemption. And so, to make a long story, well, to short story too long, some people saw some very interesting developments. One, the Balfour Declaration. Maybe we're not rebelling against the Gentiles if the British said you can have a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Right? The United Nations that votes for partition of Palestine. Maybe that's not rebelling against the Gentile world. And then there's the Holocaust. So what was the Holocaust about? One could argue, and people did argue, the Holocaust was the example par excellence of the Gentiles breaking their vow that they not persecute the Jewish people too much. So the old vows are off. And we need to have a Jewish homeland. We need to be able to defend ourselves. We need to be able to be aggressive in order to survive, or we will be destroyed. And those combination of factors began the process of re-envisioning what it means to be a religious Jew and engage in what we would call violent behaviors, militant behaviors, aggressive military kinds of actions. And that was the process that began the reimagining of Jewish tradition to sanction wars, and wars of conquest, by citing, for example, Nachmanides, who said, just settle in the land of Israel and that will be conquest. And later, citing the earlier material, and even biblical material, that said that God said that we need to conquer the land of Israel. Now, this is only active in the religious community of Zionists, not active in the secularists, because the secularists believe that you should fight to defend and establish a state of Israel. You didn't need to worry about the three vows. You didn't need to worry about Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, because we're just normal, a national community of people, said the secular Zionists. So they weren't worried about it. But it was the Orthodox that were worried about it, and they needed to have some kind of sanction to engage in the Zionist project fully and completely. There's a lot more to it than that, but eventually, with the establishment with 1967, and with this I'm going to end because we really are over, right? Yeah, so with 1967, the non-messianic hopes of many in the Orthodox Zionist world looked as if they were, what did I say, non-messianic hopes? The unarticulated messianic hopes, the hopefulness that maybe this Zionist project is really the beginning of the messianic redemption, was essentially realized, or it was understood. The tremendous success of the '67 war was understood as the divine will. Whereas you may not recall, but the municipality of Tel Aviv was digging mass graves in the soccer stadium in Tel Aviv because they thought in '67 it was going to be the end. Because remember, the massive armies were amassing all around the borders, and then in 6 days the war was over. And people said this is a miracle. And people within the traditional world said, well, this is really a miracle, a divine miracle. And it was a wonderful thing until 1973. '73 was a tremendous slap in the face to Israel, who was understood that way in a variety of different nuances by different communities within the land of Israel. One community said, the reason we suffered so terribly in 1973 war is because we didn't realize what we should have at the beginning, which is to settle the land of Israel, the biblical lands that were captured in the '67 war. And that was the beginning of the settler movement. And God will punish Israel, and say Israel, I mean the Jewish people, not just the state of Israel, if it doesn't realize its destiny of settling the lands of Israel according to the divine plan. It's a kind of neo-messianism that is applied to militancy in the tradition, and that has pushed the movement forward, and it is justified again now through the citation of a new set of texts that began to be written, especially in the late '70s, in the '80s, and those are the last few texts that you have in your handout. I will leave them to you to read on your own. Do we have any time for questions, or should we? This is it. Okay, we'll have questions at the end of the day. Right. Thank you very much.